To all of you who have gathered here today to join us for this session of the Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet. It's a pleasure to be doing this session with three people who have very different areas of interest, and together what we hope to do is shed some light on the Italian connections with India, particularly of Italians who were in India and the traces that they left behind. So would you like to, the introductions are already done, so we can perhaps jump straight into the discussion. Right behind me, as we were discussing before, is the statue of Warren Hastings dressed as a Roman senator. On the other side, there's Cornwallis as a gladiator. So starting from here to the kind of architecture that William Emerson envisioned for the Victoria Memorial Hall, which was supposed to be in the Italian Renaissance style, but with Indo-Saracenic elements to suggest its Oriental nature, down to Edward Tiretta's cemetery, the Teriti Bazaar, the architectural features in the city which often reflect the Italian blinds. One could go on. But instead of doing that, because this is kind of an evolving discussion, let me start by asking Gianluca about a book that you acquired recently from the early 1900s, is it? Where you find...
Yes, I don't write books, unlike other people on the stage. I buy books.
Fair enough.
And I came across this interesting book written in 1907 by an Italian priest who decided to come to India to have meetings with the different Italians that were living here at that time. He met with 350 Italians from Bombay to Madras to Kolkata, and he made a sort of a classification of the kind of Italians who were in this part of the world at that time. He identifies, of course, priests and missionaries, then as a second group, coal and gold miners, especially in Karnataka, and as a third broad category, he would include all the so-called professionals, which is a broad category spanning from hotelier, restaurant owners, to even barbers, which was something very interesting. Mm-hmm. So I would like to offer to the audience and to the panelists a different kind of classifications of the Italians in the subsequent and also precedent years. And this stems from my desire to focus on this part of India, which is Kolkata, West Bengal, and the neighboring states. So I think we could classify the Italians into four broad categories. The first, again, being the priests and the missionaries, and this is the realm of our friend here, Manu. Then, but it's very interesting because I found traces of an Italian monk who lived in the 18th century in Patna for 2 years, for 2 years, and he wrote a dictionary, Hindi, Latin, Italian. So we will see that there are figures who cuts across these sort of categories that we are trying to invent or design. The second one would be what I can call men of culture, artists of different kinds, and this is the kingdom of Isabella, from Olindo Ghilardi to Luigi Pio Tessitori and Federico Peliti. Just a few words on Luigi Pio Tessitori. He was an Indologist. He was called by the Bengali Asiatic Society to study local languages, in particular Rajasthani languages. So he spent a few months here in Kolkata, then he moved to Rajasthan, where he died, and where there is his grave in Bikaner. And also one hall of a museum in Bikaner is dedicated to him. So this is a presence which still remains today. Then, but this is Isabella's kingdom. And then we have two more groups, if I can quickly.
Please,
the businessmen, again, Federico Peliti, Firpo, who is also in the name of this session. And last one, the travelers. And the difference being that the traveler just passed by India and then went back, while the others have got some more lasting heritage.
Thank you so much for that. As we go along, we'll find that there are overlaps between these categories and this kind of traveling. I mean, there are travelers, there are people who are writing these travelogues, and all of it can be woven into this very interesting tapestry that is the Italian footprint in India. So maybe if we were to start with the first of the categories that you mentioned, which is the people who migrated, who came for religious reasons. And Manu, of course, has a very interesting story to tell in that regard. So Manu, would you like to share the story of Roberto?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting that, as you said, these boundaries are not very fixed. So even when somebody comes as a missionary, he's also a traveler. He's also chronicling what he's seeing, what the people's culture is, and so on. And I came across this very compelling character, which was Roberto De Nobili. He was born in the 1570s into an aristocratic family. They claim descent from a Holy Roman Emperor. They related to a couple of popes. So very established elite Italian family, where he was expected very much to continue the family tradition as, the older son of the family. The boy got into his head that he wanted to become a priest. And then he runs away from home, manages to get a training, and then sails off to India. As soon as he comes here, he sees Goa and the Portuguese. The difference is, the Portuguese are seen, they have a bad reputation in India in the early 17th century. That's when he arrives here. And they're seen as rough and like violent and so on. And he's this sort of elite, very sophisticated, highly well-educated Italian nobleman. So he decides that he doesn't want to stick around with the Portuguese. So he briefly sort of picks up languages in Goa and then Kerala. And then decides that he's going to go inland into Madurai, into the heart of Tamil Nadu, in order to preach the message of Christ and so on. What's interesting is that at this time, the Portuguese have been converting people, but their successes have largely been among coastal villages of fishermen. Francis Xavier, for example, converting whole villages of fishermen on a daily basis. And he's like, I don't want this. I don't want anybody who's low class. His words, not mine really. I'm not being classist. But he put it into his head that he wanted to get elite Indians, which for him was Brahmins.
Right.
He thought that if you convert those whom Indians treat with esteem, then all Indians would then become open to the idea of Christ and Christianity and the Bible. Now, obviously, it's not easy. You come to Madurai, this is the Nayakas are ruling there. They're great, splendid kings. There's the Madurai Meenakshi temple. It's a striking temple town. Lots of trade, huge palace of Tirumala Nayaka. So it's not a coastal fisherman's setting. It's a proper sort of well-established urban space. And he realizes that it's not easy to woo upper caste, high caste, Sanskrit-speaking Hindus unless, as he puts it, in order to save the Hindus, I shall become a Hindu. So, Roberto decides that he's going to start wearing a punul, which is the sacred thread of the Brahmins. He starts wearing saffron robes like a sannyasi. He starts, his water sanctified in the way it is for Hindu gurus. When he travels, he sits on animal skin, whatever, leopard skin, tiger skin, whatever that Swamiji sit on. He prefers that. He picks up the languages. He starts engaging with the Vedas. He starts engaging with Hindu, high sort of religious scripture, and becomes very rapidly interested in it, not just to counter it, but also as a master of the subject.
Right.
And soon enough, so he's already got a Portuguese colleague there, and he creates a caste system between the colleague and him.
Of course.
He tells the Portuguese man, you treat all the low caste people, I will deal with the upper caste Brahmins and the good Hindus, as it were. So he creates a caste system in his church. He starts adopting all the local practices. So when he eats, he sits on the floor. There's a banana leaf that's placed. It's a vegetarian meal because he's trying to match the standards of the Brahmins. And very quickly, he starts referring to the Bible as the fifth Veda. It's akin to a Veda. So he's speaking their language, Indians' language, in the sort of concepts that they value, or at least elite Indians value. And he's soon accepted very much as an elite Indian. And of course, he didn't convert very many Brahmins, but he did get lots of upper caste converts, including the brother of one of the Nayaka rulers of Chendamangalam, I think, converted. A lot of other sort of prominent people converted. and thousands overall. It caused a huge controversy in the church. You know, in Goa, for example, people were scandalized that he had basically Hinduized Christianity. He told Brahmins that if you convert, you can continue wearing your sacred thread, you can continue having your kudumi or the tuft of hair. You don't have to give up your culture to become Christians. And the interesting thing is, I don't know if you followed the news, this is stayed around in Tamil Nadu and even parts of Karnataka. A few years ago, there was an article in the Times of India about how some right-wing groups got upset because the priest of one of these churches came out in his saffron robes with a tika on his forehead, very much like a Hindu monk, but they're actually Christians. And it continued into the 18th century. They remained vegetarians, they would live simply, they would follow caste rules, and this became known as the Malabar Rites. The one pope endorsed it, another pope stopped endorsing it, but it continued. And in the 19th century, some British missionaries were very scandalized because they said these Christian processions are the same as temple processions. Right. There are the drums, there are the dancing girls, the goddesses draped in a sari and taken out, the virgin. You know, everything has been Hinduized. Is this even Christianity anymore? So that was, that's a very interesting father. Of course, there were other fathers who went off to Akbar, for example. There were Italians there, but I'll hold that story for now.
Sure. He did get thrown into prison, is it? 16?
He did briefly.
40 or so?
Yeah, he did briefly
was
for a
that
while.
An internal controversy, or I mean, is there?
I think
what happened there?
he may have pushed some buttons a bit too much at times. Some of the missionaries, even if you're dressed in saffron, if you stand outside a temple and basically say all these gods are fake, people are bound to get upset. So I think he did get into some trouble that way. But on the whole, he was something of a success.
What an absolutely fascinating story. And I mean, I read about it quite recently. I mean, I read your piece on it, in fact. And it also reminded me of a very similar figure, that of Hindu Stewart, who is buried in the South Park Street Cemetery, who was an Irishman who kind of had a very similar trajectory and was particularly fascinated with the sari. That was something that he kept waxing eloquent about. Speaking of, the Portuguese-Italian trouble, of course, there's also the figure of Eduardo Tireta, who built Calcutta's first purpose-built private bazaar in modern times, which was, and he was a friend of Giacomo Casanova, the legendary Casanova. And he came to India in the 1780s. He started his own bazaar. He became the civil architect, and I don't know what his claim to this was. I mean, he wasn't possibly trained. But the conflict with the Portuguese church happened because when his wife passed away, Angelique de Carrion, he buried her in the only Catholic church in Kolkata at the time, which was the Portuguese church, and he realized to his horror that the bodies were taken out before they had time to decompose. So that kind of prompted him to buy his own plot of land and set up his cemetery, which is now the APJ school, which was demolished later. But as Gianluca said, I mean, there are a number of different spheres in which there were these exchanges. And coming to Isabella, one of the most interesting and rich histories in that regard is that of the exchanges in art. Yes. So perhaps if you could shed some light on...
So, is this working?
I think so. Hold it closer.
Okay. Huh?
Hold it closer.
Okay. Well, yes, I'm an art historian, and just very recently I started researching Italians in India. And this new interest started after, I'm going to tell you like a little story, which I think it's interesting. I started after I read an article that was circulating online on social media, and it was talking about this Italian architect that built a palace in Bihar, in a town called Rajnagar, and it gave the name, the date, and a picture of this beautiful palace, and this really struck my attention. I thought, who is he? I mean, I've been working on, Indian studies for a long time, yet this name I have never heard. So I started doing research, and that's when I actually met only virtually our consul, who helped me to track down this figure. He sent someone to that place, And he found a plaque on the wall with the name of this person, which was different from the article that was circulating. And eventually we found that he was not Italian. Sorry, that's I was very, very disappointed, let me tell you. So, but that, in the meantime, I started learning more and more about Italians in India, especially artists. And so let me first tell you that there has always been, well, always, in the late colonial period, there was a great interest in Western art in India and also in Italian art. And you have a lot in, a lot that is really unstudied in Indian museums. Many sculptures were shipped, really, and commissioned and shipped from Italy to India. And just to mention maybe the most famous of it is the Veiled Rebecca, which is in Hyderabad at the Salarjung Museum. I'll tell you more of I have the dates because I'm not good with dates, but it's dated 1876, and it was by someone called Giovanni Benzoni, who was a very famous neoclassical sculptor. So it's a beautiful white marble statue. So when you go to Hyderabad, go and see it. And also the same museum has a big room with Italian paintings. Some are copies, but some are actually originals, I think. And there are many other important sculptures that were shipped. But I'm more interested actually in the Indians, in the Italians that were actually working here, right? And there are not many that I've been able to track. It's really a work in progress. So one of the important ones worked at the court of Baroda. He was the official, one of the official artists at the court of Baroda. His name is Augusto Felici. And if you'll ever go to Baroda, to the Lakshmi Vilas Palace, you'll find some of his sculptures, especially, I mean, he's famous for white marble sculptures and bronzes. And what he did, there are at least two, three famous bronzes that reproduce Indian themes, like the Tanjore dancer or the fakir we have, and they're all depicted in a academic style, so Italian style. So he kind of did that a little bit like Ravi Verma, if you want. But coming to Calcutta, since we are here, I was able to track two artists. One of them you might know, but you don't know he was an artist. The other one probably you don't know. So the first one that I'd like to mention is someone called Olindo Ghilardi, who came to India in 1885, and he stayed here for 20 years of his life. And why is he famous? He became the vice principal of the Calcutta School of Art, and he was one of the art teachers of Abanindranath Tagore. He most probably taught him the use of watercolor, but I think he has also some interesting stories about him going to the house of Ghilardi. So I think there was also a friendship that was born in this relationship. The second one is, I see here a nice box of Firpo, which is in the title of our panel. I think because the name is so familiar to people in Calcutta, I'm not actually going to talk about him, but his predecessor. The reason why Firpo was here is because someone called Federico Pellitti established one of the first restaurants, Italian restaurants, in Calcutta, definitely the first. And after him, many other came, and one of them is Firpo. So this Pelliti is, you know him as someone like a restaurant owner, someone who was a hotelier as well, but he was an artist. So he was trained as an artist. He was a sculptor. He had a degree in sculpture. And he came here after winning a competition when he became the official pastry chef for Lord Mayo. So he became also a pastry chef. And Lord Mayo died a few years later. And Pelliti, rather than going back home, he decided to settle here and open his business. So his artistic side, let me tell you something about this. He was a photographer also, and he took photographs of his creations. So some of them are real sculptures that he made. Some of them are these sculptures of sugar that he made to sell. One of them is a famous one. For me, it's like a dreamy thing. It's the Taj Mahal of Sugar, which won the gold medal at an exhibition here in Calcutta in 1883. So famous. He also won another prize, another gold medal in Turin at the end of the century for his collection of photographs. No one knows what that collection was and contained, but maybe his photographs were there, but we also know that he collected photographs of the major names that were here in Calcutta. So he has Born and Shepherd, but also Raja Deen Dayal's photographs. He probably had a friendship with him too, because he was able to capture some private parties, some beautiful photographs of private parties in Shimla. So I'm sure there are more, artists to talk about, but I think these two are the main one and kind of relevant to, where we are today. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for that. The one that you mentioned, the other Italian person who used to stay with Ghilardi, this is someone who finds mention in 2 or 3 texts, but we don't really know a great deal about him. There's this one passage in Abanindranath Tagore's memoirs where he says that he went to Ghilardi's house to paint, and every day he would hear a piano and a violin playing downstairs, and he would paint to those tunes. And then one day he suddenly heard that the piano wasn't there anymore. And he said that the violin seemed to be weeping that day and I could no longer paint. So he asks Ghilardi what has happened, and Ghilardi says, don't you know, his daughter has run away from home. So, and there's this beautiful passage where Abanindranath says that in the room next to the staircase, I could see the old man sitting with his head bent, the violin resting against the back of his chair. Strands of his silver hair were floating in the breeze because of the fan. So, and this is a person who is called Manzato. So he was Guido Julio Manzato, who's identified as a band master in Lucknow in 1902. And then he comes to Calcutta. He has 2 daughters, one of whom presumably runs away from home. The other got married, and their family is still, we are still in touch, kind of, retracing this family history. So that's another, and this is featured in Radharaman Mitra's Kolikata Darpan. This is the house that he calls Dui Italiener Bari. And so that's just another one of these. So there are a lot of these phantom figures who, really need to be fleshed out and put in place.
It
Manu,
reminds me of, when I went to Madurai, I mentioned Tirumala Nayaka's palace, right? It's a striking structure. You don't expect that in a city like Madurai. You think it's just the temple. But then you go to the palace, these giant Corinthian pillars, probably as tall as these, huge, stout pillars. And you ask anybody there who built it, they say, Tirumala Nayaka built it with an Italian architect. The presence of this unnamed Italian is sort of all over the place. Where are those styles from? They're from Italy. That this comes up in different places, sometimes in very unexpected ways, but there's no name. It's always just this nameless Italian who appears and disappears.
I think it's just fake news. Yes. it's like the one that I was looking for and it wasn't there. Yeah.
But there's clearly some stylistic elements that are identified as such. And we were discussing earlier about the marbles and the chandeliers and a lot of other sort of features of architecture, including the Venetian blinds and all of that, which carry this legacy. So,
Can we
moving-
add something
Yes,
about
please.
the house of Ghilardi?
Yeah.
I think when we were talking about it, you mentioned it was not far from that hotel that I'm looking for. So basically by reading this literature, old, like late 19th century literature, I found that there was an Italian from my hometown, that is Mantova, who was running a hotel in Calcutta, not far from the house of Ghilardi. So we're still looking, but about that, I mean, the precise location, but kind of the area must be
any
similar.
leads on that will be appreciated. So that actually helps us nicely segue from the arts and the cultures to the trade and commerce, the business aspects of it. So Gianluca, would you like to come in on that with any of your recent explorations?
Yes, we have been, as the Consulate General of Italy, in the past month, we have been to Darjeeling to pay a sort of a tribute to an Italian who is also not well known. He's an Italian and Maltese mixed origin kind of guy. His name is Luis Ildebrando Mandelli, and he's probably the only or one of the very few examples of Italian tea planters. You know, Italians are not well known for coming to this part of the world as tea planter. He was running, like, at a certain point, 4 tea estates in Darjeeling, but he became more famous as an ornithologist because he started studying all the birds of the Himalaya, and then he sent the stuffed birds to UK, to London, and somehow they are kept in one section of the British museums. And even today there are 6 different kinds of birds whose name has got the Mandelli word in the scientific name.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and if you want to remain in Darjeeling, I'm sure you are familiar with Glenaries, the eatery. At a certain point, you should know that it was run and probably created by this Italian family called Vado. Once again, we know, but we don't know enough because it's difficult to find documents about this. And in Darjeeling again, there used to be a hotel called Woodlands that was at a certain point run and managed by an Italian, one Mr. Righi. Again, I found only one source quoting this particular person. We are talking about the early 20th century, but it's difficult. Let's put it like this.
So you mentioned in that the book by Giuseppe Capra, is it? That he lists out the different sort of gaps that are there in Calcutta, in India, that might be filled up in terms of the confectionaries, the
Yes, it's very interesting because he wrote this sort of report of his travel for the Italian government. He was not sent by the Italian government, but he thought it may be useful also for the government of Italy at that time to know what the situation of the Italians in India is. And he tries to identify possibilities of work and jobs for Italians in Italy at that time. And he identifies, of course, the mining as one sector, the confectionery as another section, the, how do I call it, the special parts of constructions, like those who would take care of maybe some mosaics or the tiles or this or that. So it's interesting to know that at the beginning of the 20th century, there was this study on how Italians could come to India and work here and settle here.
So, of course, Pilates is before, I mean, they set up shop sometime in the 1880s, is it?
Well, as she said, he started in 1869
Okay.
because he found himself in a faraway place without his employer, without the job for which he was called here, but he decided to use the Italian creativity and he created his own business, both here and in Shimla. And the restaurant in Shimla features in one of the short stories of Kipling.
Right. So, speaking of travel, let's maybe journey back a bit further because, I mean, Italians writing about India has a fairly long history. So, would any of you like to go back to the Mughals, for instance, and
I
speak
think
of-
you're
Yeah?
referring to Acquaviva, one of the
Right.
Jesuit fathers who was an Italian who went off to Akbar's court because Akbar wanted to see Christian scripture, and these three fathers set out with Acquaviva among them. Again, you know, a very prominent family in Italy, had come here quite determined to sort of save the Hindus and so on. And on the way they're seeing temples, they're seeing sculptures, and they're very confused because one part of them is horrified by, say, nudity and so on. Another side of them is also like, maybe this is the Virgin and maybe this is Jesus Christ. We have no idea. But there's a lot of speculation going on about whether Indian sculptures and statues are actually Christian somehow. Then they get to Akbar, and first they're very hopeful because Akbar receives them and he takes one of the volumes they've carried and, you know, touches his head to it. Actually, each of them, one after the other, Akbar sort of venerates them, and they're convinced. Very easy job. We're going to convert this man very quickly. Of course, Acquaviva is very soon disabused of these notions because he discovers that Akbar is also following his Sunni faith. He's also bowing to the sun in the morning. He's also wearing a tikka. He's also celebrating Diwali. He's doing everything. You know, every religion he's picking and choosing what he likes. And that's when Acquaviva and his friends realize that, look, we don't want to be part of this buffet. We came here to be the main course, and here we are reduced to just one segment on the dining table. And they eventually leave. You know, they're very heartbroken because Akbar's very close to them. At one point, he's taken them for a military campaign and he's put his arm around Acquaviva like a friend. And so he's making all the very friendly gestures, but there's no conversion in sight. The good thing that happens, though, is these men go back, but the presence of these Jesuits initially means that later more missions come, and with them artists come to the Mughal court.
Right.
In fact, some sources say, Portuguese sources I believe, that ultimately 3 Mughal princes were even converted to Christianity, although Jahangir got it done because he wanted to remove them from the line of succession. So he just
Strategic
thought that if you
conversion.
convert them into
Yeah.
Christianity, then they're not going to pose a threat to the throne. And also they say that, you know, they wanted some aid from the Portuguese, and then when that didn't come, they converted back to Islam. So that's the story there. But, you know, in terms of travelers in general, one, again, very arresting figure is Pietro della Valle. I think that's how you pronounce his name. And my favorite anecdote is when he comes to Calicut in Kerala in 1605 or so. And I said this in my earlier panel also. People will think I'm obsessed with this, but, you know, people walked about topless in Kerala in those days, including royal women. And this gentleman comes wearing his velvets and his very you know, elaborate European clothes in the heat of tropical Kerala. And he sits in the darbar and 2 princesses enter. And they're just wearing a blue silk around the waist, lots of jewelry, but no further fabric. And he's flabbergasted. He looks at them thinking, why are these women naked? Is this the norm here? And then he looks up to the balcony and sees the queen is also naked, half naked. Everybody's walking around like that. And the princesses, they're just as mystified with him. They come, touch him, prod him, you know, look at his clothes, and they wonder why he's dressed up like this in this particular climate. And that's just a little anecdote from his travel diaries. He went to Mangalore, he went to a bunch of places, not just India. He's got a whole travel diary. But again, it's one of those wonderful snippets that tells you about the experiences of these gentlemen when they're actually coming to alien societies. And also, in a sense, the response of the aliens to them, because they're like, why are you acting so weird? So, yeah.
There's also Niccolo Manucci, right? I mean, who
Oh, yes.
comes to...
So yes,
Yeah.
well, that's a bit later.
That's a bit
I
later.
think it was traveling during the time of I think Aurangzeb, and a little bit later. So I think the funny part of the whole Manucci story for me is that he was able to enter the court by claiming he was a physician. You know, I wouldn't want to be his patient. I mean, because I wasn't trained like that. But I mean, for me, art historian, what's so important about him is that apart from the Storia do Mogor, which is his travelogue, which you might know. It's been published and reprinted several
Translated
times.
also, I think.
So he sent his memoirs before dying. He died in Chennai. Before dying, he sent everything, I think, to France, and together with his travelogue, he sent paintings that he commissioned. So some of the paintings, in some of them you see him, so we know how he looks like, that's good. And all the Mughals, like the genealogy of the Mughals, starting from Babur, Humayun, so that was like a common thing to have and to commission. And then another of his collection has the costumes of India, which was new. So maybe the missionaries brought back many stories, to Italy, but no visual. So he provided the visual to these stories. So we would know how people were dressed, how Shiva would look like, and all. So, and these paintings some of them are in Venice and some of them are in Paris. So they're also online, actually. So
Manushi is also a big source on the big feud between Aurangzeb and his brother, Dara Shikoh. He exaggerates his own role in things as well.
Yes,
he has a tendency to overstate his own centrality to everything,
Of course.
In every important episode, Manushi is there. but that's I suppose that's how it was in those days. There was a template to how these travel diaries were written.
Yeah.
He may have exaggerated a bit more than usual, but certainly
it's
a very
like
colorful
the Italian
figure.
who built the Taj Mahal kind of story, right?
But he came also to West Bengal.
Yep.
He didn't stay here for long because he's more based in southern India or Lahore and those places. But he came to Hooghly from Dhaka. He crossed the Sundarbans and then he went to Hooghly, where we are at the beginning of his adventure. He does something of a historical, probably, significance. He helps 3 Portuguese Jesuits, whom he doesn't like very much, but he helps them to obtain the permission to build a church in the Hooghly district from the then governor of this part of West Bengal, of that part of West Bengal. So exactly, we are wondering, what church are we talking about? Portuguese link?
I suspect it's the Bandel Church, but I mean, just figured this out today, so we are yet to confirm exactly what this is. Yeah, anything else that any of the other travelogues or anything else that you want to share?
Well, I have also bought, because again, I don't write, but I buy books. I bought this book by this Italian traveler called Emilio Bertarelli. He traveled to India again at the beginning of the 20th century. And of course, he came to Kolkata. It's very interesting to know his impressions of the city and of the Bengal society. About the cities, he says that he found a very cosmopolitan city. He talks about a blending of different ethnicities. He talks about places in Kolkata. He said he had his lunch at the most famous Italian in Kolkata, Peliti, although he misspells the name. And then he goes, visits, of course, government's house. He says that the Maidan would be the envy of every European city at that time. And then he goes to the botanical garden to see the banyan. And he gives us also a little bit of story of that tree at that time. So it could be interesting to see how the story of the tree has evolved and if we follow this. And then talking about the society, he says Bengalis are, how can I put it, are not at ease with the British rule. They are intelligent. They understand that autonomy can come through education. And so they build colleges, they send people to schools because they understand that home rule will come only after this spreading of education and knowledge in the society. And he foresees the seeds of an involvement also of the working class in this sort of political development, if we want to call it like that.
There's, I mean, they're not really businessmen,
Yeah.
I mean, or maybe they are military businessmen, but there's also stray references to these Italian mercenaries in the late 18th century. I forget the
Right.
name of the scholar. Somebody's actually done a full list of about 200 or odd, foreigners who helped Indian princes from, the Sikhs to the Maharaja of Travancore and so on, modernize their armies and their weapons and so on. And I suspect in that there are a few Italians who are artillery experts and, had some kind of technical knowledge, which they applied in service of these Indian rulers. So I suppose there's, something to be investigated there.
Yeah. So we have spoken a fair bit about the history of these connections. I was just wondering whether what kinds of connections we can hope to build now, if there are.
Well, I'm a
because-
diplomat, so I don't do much, but you are all scholars, so I publicly invite you to help me in this endeavor
I publicly accept
to
it.
give some sort of physical documentation to all of these stories. And these are not all the stories we can think of.
I'm going to be very naughty and say
Yeah,
that one
please.
way of building the relationship is he sits here and gives everybody an Italian visa as we are sitting at the end of this conversation.
Yeah.
I was waiting for the visa question to come. It has come.
Okay, a slightly easier request, which is to settle this debate that we have had in Kolkata for ages. Firpos or Firpos?
Of course,
Firpo.
Of
Okay.
course. I.
Thanks for that.
All Italian vowels are long. Yeah.
Well, I mean, this could really go on in a way. I mean, not just tonight, but this is a project that that holds a lot of promise and requires further research to kind of, like I said, I mean, all of these spectral figures, some about whom we know a little more, some about whom we know not that much. So, and like you're doing, I mean, it's something that spans the entire length and breadth of the country, and not just the country, I mean, I guess of the region as a whole. You mentioned places in Assam that were named after the queen in Italy, Margherita or something
Yes,
like
there
yeah?
is. We have in Assam, we have in Shillong, because we had an archbishop of Italian citizenship, but we also had the equivalent of Peliti and Firpo. We had one Mr. Guidetti. You pronounce the U, it's not Gui, it's Guidetti. And his confectionery was open until, I think, maybe 30, 40 years ago.
Mhm. Well, thank you for that, Isabella, Gianluca, and Manu. I'll open the discussion up to questions now, in case there's anyone in the audience who has a question. Sorry, I can barely see. Yeah.
Okay, firstly, thanks for the fascinating discussion. I am extremely delighted that you people are now trying to explore the Italian heritage in Bengal and across India. My humble request is that you mentioned the name of Federico Pelletti, who was the official confectioner to Governor of India in those days. I'm a Viceroy of India. Viceroy was based in Calcutta in those days. My humble request is that in Calcutta, we still have a dilapidated building, which was the restaurant of Pelletti. It is in a very bad shape, standing next to Great Eastern Hotel. The only relics what we have there is a marble plaque, a marble tablet, where the Pelletti's name is there. Unfortunately, it's an abuse to history. That particular tablet is also not easily visible. Some great Bengali or some great Marwari trader had put a AC over that. I just want to put it as an Indian, as a Bengali, as a lover of heritage. Can from your level, is it possible for you to push Bengal government to at least make that place visible so that anybody who is coming to Calcutta, we can take him there? Or the next generation, my son, I can take to him and show how cosmopolitan the Calcutta city was. It's a humble request. If you people are fighting for the heritage to revive, start with Pelletti. Thank you.
Who is this question for? For me? Okay. As a diplomat, I issue visas, but I don't restore buildings. This is as a general thing.
You can issue checks maybe to restore buildings.
But no, I don't think my voice is powerful, but I would like to reassure you that also after the visit of the ambassador, we were all very impressed by the importance of this place in the history, not just only gastronomical history of the city. The point is that it's a privately owned building, so of course you have to involve the private part. It's a complicated mosaic, but let's see what happens.
Thank you for that. I suppose that, you know, discussions, maybe exhibitions, so on and forth. I mean, before these interventions happen, there also needs to be a certain momentum that is generated, which, you know, which convinces a critical mass that this needs to happen. So I think in whatever small ways we also can contribute. I mean, we can start with those steps and then hope that the powers that be kind of, you know, recognize the importance of what you just mentioned. So thank you for that. Any other questions, comments, observations? Any new characters that you know of that we haven't mentioned? Because this really isn't meant to be an exhaustive list that we are putting out there. So there may well be figures that we missed. Anything else that you wish to add to the conversation? Yes, please. There's someone.
I don't have a question, but I would request Gianluca and Isabella to visit the government museum in Patna. They have exquisite figurines of Indian gods and goddesses and kings and queens carved in marble and other materials, all in the European style, because there was a surplus of artisans and artists in Europe who were looking for work, and they all came here. And the Patna Museum has a vast collection of all this. So you have women wearing saris but looking completely Italian. And the tradition of weaving, like you have mantua lace or laces in other parts of Italy, you know, that sort of is mirrored in India too. Because you had a lot of Chinese travelers and traders selling their expertise as well as the silk threads to both India and to Italy. I mean, you must visit Patna. I hope you find the scope to do that.
Thank you. Yes, I'm in touch with the director of that museum. We are trying to build something before I go so that we can give a little bit of content to the visit. Otherwise, you say that as diplomats, we just go around and do nothing. So we are trying to put some substance in it, but I will go. Thank you.
That reminds me of the mosaic in Baroda Palace as well, which depicts, they say, some scene from one of the epics. But again, you know, as she was saying, they're all dressed in Indian clothes, but they're completely European in their appearance. So, you know, it was the Italians who were imported to make the mosaic. They somehow didn't capture the Indian faces. They just went with what they knew, I guess.
Any further questions? Yes, please.
Hi. I was just wondering, during the mid to late 18th century, when a lot of artists from Europe came to Calcutta and started working with our indigenous artists, our, you know, folk and tribal artists. And that period and they taught them how to make art with oil painting. That's when oil painting came into India. And they are known as the early Dutch Bengal oils. I was just wondering, were there maybe Italians also in there?
I've been looking for names, and you know, I looked also at earlier stuff, but I haven't been able to find or trace. But yeah, thank you. I will look into that.
There is also a problem, I think, of how these names are spelled, and sometimes Italian names are made something different, and so you don't think that name is Italian, and the other way around.
But I wouldn't be too surprised.
Until you find where someone was born, or you know, some document. Otherwise, it sounds French, or you know. So it's a work in progress, but thank you. That's a good pointer. Yeah.
I was just saying that, you know, I wouldn't be surprised that a lot of Italians also made it, because you do find references. For example, in the early 1810s, there's this reference to the Rani of Travancore giving European paintings to the British resident, that she had somehow collected. There's no name of the artist, nothing, which means that when these artists started coming, some became famous, but for every famous person, there's probably 2 or 3 not so well-known people. So for all you know, there are Italians in that set that came in the 18th century.
Okay, I think with that, we'll bring this session. There's one final question, if we could take that, perhaps.
I don't have a, okay. We've talked about so many Italians who came to India.
Sorry,
But I said we've talked about so many Italians who came to India, but we've missed out on one very important one, is Saint John Bosco.
True. Absolutely, yeah.
Oh, we missed many of them, right? Let me tell you, even Montessori, or it's a long list, but you have to narrow it down, right?
Yes, I thank you for this quotation, because I realize that a number of people don't even know that Don Bosco is Italian. There is a statue, and somebody who was instrumental for this statue to be put up in the center of the city was another Italian priest, this Father Stroscio, who moved to India around the Second World War when he was 17, and he died 90 plus 3 years ago. So maybe some of you may have heard about him. He built that auxilium church in Gobra that you can see on your left when you take the flyover going to the airport. And being a Salesian, he was also instrumental to having the Don Bosco statue in the center of the city.
I just thought, we were talking about all the Italians who've come here. I think we might as well end with an Indian who ended up going to Italy and passing away there. There was a Maratha prince called Rajaram Chhatrapati in 1870 as a young man of 20. He was this very promising prince. The British thought, he would be this great reformer and so on. He went on a tour of Europe, and then in Florence in Italy, he caught a chill, ended up dying in Florence, and on the banks of the Arno, is that the river? Yeah, his Brahmin priest, everybody, they had a full Hindu cremation on the banks of the Arno standing in for Ganga water and so on. He was cremated there, and I believe there is a memorial to him somewhere in Florence.
There's a statue in a park, and there is also a bridge called the Bridge of the Indian. And this is what I always tell the Indian students who are going to study in Florence: go and look for traces of India in Florence, because there are some.
Yeah, and this opens up maybe next year we'll discuss Indians in Italy at the Lit Meet. So until then, thank you all for being a part of this discussion. Thank you for taking an active part in it. And thanks to Manu, Gianluca, and Isabella. And with that, we'll take Mr. Hastings' leave, and have a good night. Thank you.
A huge round of applause once again for our panelists, please. Thank you so much, Manu. Thank you, Gianluca. Thank you, Isabella, and Sujaan, as always. Thank you so much. We'll be back again tomorrow at the main venue at 11:20 and the quadrangle at 3:30 p.m. Please do join us for the final day of Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet 2022. Thank you. Good night.